just to give you an idea of the cascading effects of working on an old car. So I've got this Dino at the shop, and one of the things I wanted to do was replace the coolant hoses that were running down the spine of the car. These coolant hoses are original, so they were in decent shape, but you know, running down the center of the car and just being there, it was time to pull them and check them. And they're 50 some odd years old, so I think it was time. I'm glad I pulled them because you could see some rust was forming inside the tube, and I cleaned up the rust, and if that was allowed to continue, it could have rusted this hose in place and really would have had trouble trying to pull it out. So I pulled the hoses out and started to put new ones in and trying to get everything back into place. And so that's going fine. So the next thing I wanted to do was I wanted to pull the alternator out, because as I was changing the belts on it, I noticed that it was just completely covered in oil. It's a common problem with these cars, because what happens is if you look up way up in there, it's just a ton of oil dripping down, and there's a little chain tensioner that's up top that tends to have an O-ring that leaks. And I fixed the leak, but the problem is it's been dripping on that alternator for years and years and years. The charging system still works, but what I'm concerned about is the brushes inside the alternator being covered with oil, and eventually it could be susceptible to failing. So I started to pull the alternator out, and what the hell? So what happens is this alternator is run off the front of the car. Okay, so there's a belt that goes across the little pulley on the alternator. Okay, that alternator is, the back side of it is attached to the emissions on a US car. So there's this huge aluminum bracket underneath where the header comes down, tucked up underneath the header on the outside of the V, that holds the air pump. And that air pump, even though it's not connected right now because most people just stop running the emissions, is still in this car. A lot of these cars of this age, the first thing they did was pull the air pump out, because it's just a big heavy piece that's not even being used, and it's a lot of people eliminate it. But this car, because it's such low mileage, still has the original air pump, so it does not come out very easily. I've cut the vacuum lines because they're old. I'm going to probably replace them. I have to decide what I'm going to do with this air pump, but the first problem is trying to get the damn thing out. Alternators on the Dinos and 308s, they're tucked up way underneath the car, and they're already difficult to get to. Then you add the complexity of this air pump and this crazy bracket that they designed. Oh my God. So what I've kind of decided to do, because I've tried to get this thing out and it's fighting me all the way out. And another thing on our project that we want to take care of is the AC compressor, which is another bowl full of crazy that's tucked inside this notch tucked inside this notch of the fuel tank. So I want to change some of the lines, because again, same thing. I could go ahead and try to charge this system, the air conditioning system, because the customer is like, oh, I'd really like to get the air conditioning going. My feeling is, okay, but the lines running from the front to the back of the car are 50 years old. So it's time to change these hoses, because I could charge it. It may hold pressure for a little bit, but within a year, it'll run out of coolant, the refrigerant again. So the best thing to do, because what happens is I think these hoses get permeable. So the best thing is to replace it with modern hose and replace all that. Well, the easier thing, because of how crazy this thing is tucked up inside, is to pull the fuel tank. So I'm looking at trying to pull this alternator out. I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll take care of the alternator first before I take care of the air conditioner. No, let's pull the fuel tank, get access better to this alternator. Maybe I could slide it out straight out this way as opposed to the back way, because I have the bracket unbolted. There's just no room to pull it straight out this way because of the fuel tank. But if I'm going to move the fuel tank out of the way, then I can pull this alternator, take care of that. Then I could get to the air conditioner bracket, take that all out, get to the hoses up top, run the air conditioning. So all of this kind of happens at the same time. So yeah, I mean, it's just this cascading effect, but part of this whole thing with this car is just to get some of these things that just haven't been replaced in 50 some odd years, despite the mileage, and it's just aging out. So it's pretty involved, but I think we're gonna get it done. But holy hell, sometimes this Dino is just crazy. But we'll just keep plugging away at it. So let me show you what I got going on. This setup on the Dino basically sits by the firewall on the car, and it is the air pump setup, but it's driven off of the back of the alternator. But they created this big bracket to hold everything together. So this big cast aluminum piece sits. Part of it is probably to shield it a little bit from the heat, but it's this overbuilt piece that cradles everything together. So from under the car, all you see is this. So if I wanted to take the alternator out, even if I unbolted this one, which is the pivot, and then this one's the adjuster, this whole thing swings because the air pump is attached to the shaft. So in order to tension this whole thing tensions off of this pulley, which is then tensioned here. So it's got the whole bracket, this whole aluminum cast iron setup pivots. But then what's interesting is the pivot of the whole thing pivots here on the bracket that then is bolted to the block. I started to unbolt this back here thinking that maybe I can get it to go, but that doesn't matter because this is part of this whole thing. So the only choice is to pull this whole thing out. You can see why I pulled it out. The alternator is just absolutely soaked in oil, and I would need to get it and clean it off and then send it out for rebuilding and everything checked, because I couldn't put this thing back in or let it run like this covered in oil. I think it's just going to be destined to fail. The big decision at this point is whether or not I'm going to put this guy back in, but we'll leave that decision for another day. I got the alternator back from my rebuilder. If you remember from before, it was completely oil soaked, and when he put it on the test bench, he said it wasn't charging at all. So he went ahead and disassembled it, rebuilt it, new brushes, cleaned out all the gunk and oil and all that other stuff that was in it, and bearings and all that other stuff, bushings. So it's all back together. Hopefully that'll, I'm glad we did it, because even though it seemed to be charging when it was in the car for me, I saw how badly it was soaked in oil, and I was just like, it's probably on its last legs. So I'm glad we went through the process of doing it, even though it was a little bit of a pain in the butt because of this whole setup. So my dilemma has been, what am I going to do with this air pump? I've been struggling with whether I should keep it in there or not. It's not super heavy, but at the same time, it's kind of like this waste of resources. I don't think it's a huge parasitic draw, but it's a coupler. So what I've done is I've removed the coupler. I've decided at the very least I'm going to remove the coupler here. I'll put it in a bag and leave it with the car, so that way if somebody ever for some reason wants to put an air pump back in on this car, the emissions air pump, and reconnect it so that this thing works, they'll still have the parts and pieces to it. But I've decided I'm going to keep it mounted, because sometimes these cars, they want to see emissions equipment on these cars because they're trying to certify them, and without getting into the whole thing with Class K certification, I'm concerned about taking it out and then having somebody in Ferrari, when they want to certify this car, if they ever certify this car, to say, we'd like to see the air pump, and it's not there. Even if it's in the trunk, they might not allow it to be certified. But for general operating purposes, I think having this disconnected, I think, is a better thing, and I'm just going to bolt it in place. And according to some people I spoke to, you can get this alternator out this way. With it attached to all this and everything else that was bolted in place, it felt nearly impossible for me to pull it out. So I ended up, since the gas tank was in the way for my air conditioning, I ended up pulling it out the front way and taking it all out as a unit. But from what I've been told, is that this alternator is as crazy as it's mounted in there. It should come out without having to take this whole bracket out. So that's what we got. We got a new alternator, a rebuilt alternator, and I'm going to go on to the next step of putting it back in the car. As I'm working on this 246 Dino, I'm doing a slight little modification on the inside here. If you look above the alternator, I've fabricated this little aluminum shield, and basically all it does is it kind of keeps the drips away, because that above it, that little cylinder piece right there, that is a chain tensioner, and it tends to leak. There's an O-ring, there's also a gasket and all sorts of stuff, and it tends to leak over there. And on this one, it sits right above the alternator and really hard to get to, and the only reason why it looks so easy to get to right now is because I've removed the air conditioner compressor and I've removed the gas tank. So this is about as the most access I'm ever going to get in here. So it looks like it's really kind of accessible, but it's really not. So putting a little shield up there just to cover the tensioner, because look, if it starts to leak, you can pull the tensioner out, you can change the O-ring, but still it's not an easy thing to get to when everything is installed. So I kind of decided to obviously seal it, clean it, get it so it stops dripping. But if it starts to drip again, I've made this tiny little aluminum shield to just kind of divert the oil around the alternator and also around the header, because as it drips, look at the header is right below it. So as it drips onto the alternator, it kind of follows it down and then eventually onto this header, and then it'll smoke. So this kind of diverts it around it and kind of onto the ground. I hate making little stopgap measures like that, but you know, in a Dino, it's probably not a bad idea.